Hi, Freya.
Hi,
Thanks.
Daniel.
Thanks so much for making time for this conversation. And every now and then we have these beautiful conversations, catching up on what's happening with Common Earth, and I thought it would be really nice to share one of them more widely, and also to give people an opportunity to know you and your work better, and the amazing work of Common Earth that you've been helping to pull together. So. I often start with just inviting people to tell a little bit about their story, and yours is fascinating. So how did you get into feeling passionate about contributing to the healing of this earth and her people, like the regenerative impulse?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, first of all, I grew up in a really rural area of the United States in Vermont. And I grew up in sort of an alternative community. It wasn't an intentional community, but it was a very close-knit community, sort of full of artists and poets. My mother is a musician and a poet. My father is a philosopher and a philosophy professor. And both my parents were, my father, when we were growing up, was part of the mythopoetic men's movement. So, was studying with people like Michael Mead and Martine Prechtel, was sort of active in our community doing youth initiations. And and there was just a group of, a close-knit community of these sorts of mythopoetic types doing theater in the woods and storytelling and having bonfires late into the evening, and so I grew up in that sort of context, and then when my parents got divorced, my mother, my brother and sister and I moved to a very rural part of Vermont. I mean, where we lived before was rural as well, but we moved completely off the grid. So like we restored an old farmhouse at the end of a dirt road, and moved to a community that was setting up a small Steiner school. So it was maybe 20 families or something. And so I also grew up very connected to sort of a Waldorf Steiner community. And so I spent a lot of time outdoors and in the woods, and that, I think, that connection at an early age. I mean, of course, then I went to school and went away to college, and I lost a lot of that. But as I got closer to sort of thinking about regeneration, it was easier for me to get back to that place, because I had sort of the foundations in which I grew up were very connected to the outdoors. And yet at the same time, I also sort of, when I was growing up, just considered those topics another subject to study, right? It wasn't, even though I was fully immersed in all of those sort of inquiries into the mystic. My mother also was part of a satsangi community. We lived near an ashram, and a community that practiced in the Sant Mat tradition, which is very influenced by, it's like an Indian spiritual movement that sort of came into being in the 13th century in India, and was very influenced by, the Sufi poets and other Indian mystical poets. So I was immersed in all of that, but then I still had this sense of it was just another thing to study, right? Just another topic. So in a way, my journey has been to come full circle and realize that it's not just another topic to study, it's actually a deeper inquiry into what it means to be human on the earth, and now that feels particularly relevant. So anyway, that was a long way of saying that my childhood and sort of upbringing had a strong role to play in me getting towards regeneration, even though I have a very interdisciplinary background and have not studied science or anything. That, full disclosure, I'm probably one of your less scholarly interviewees.
I think you've done a hell of a lot of studying in the last 3 years, just watching you talk to everybody who's weaving into the Common Earth network, that's a couple of master's degrees right there, I think.
Yeah.
But the story you just told, like having a little daughter myself at the moment, I feel like what a childhood. I'm sure it wasn't always easy, and having your parents separate is always difficult, but that connection, and I think the point that you just made of that really, this whole, people need to get that it's about being and practicing regeneration. Like it's a way of being as well as a way of doing, and having had that foundation of actually living in community and living with connection to land and the wider community of life in that way, I think is such an important foundation, and also speaks to the importance of education in the long-term creation of regenerative cultures. How did you get, when, so I know that you worked for quite a long time with this organization, A Growing Culture, and helping, like, spend some time in Africa and all that. I'd love to learn more about that organization and what you did there.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was a very roundabout way of, I was an art history major in college, and worked in the arts arena for many years, and then got really interested in library science, actually, and I have a master's of science in information and library science. And while I was in graduate school, I realized that there were sort of, in the library science world, there were two sort of key communities. One was sort of the traditional library community that was focused on sort of special collections and books and museums, and I had been very involved in that community. But when I got into library school, I realized that there was this other side of the community that was working around open access and freely available government information and public libraries, because in the United States, public libraries have an incredible sort of history where they're these spaces that provide free and open access to anyone, essentially. And so they've been, they're very involved in sort of the social justice movement. And so I got into activism in library school when I was sort of training to be a librarian. And and it was, Aaron Swartz had committed suicide a few years before I was in library school, and that was still sort of really influencing and affecting the library community. He was an open access activist, sort of trying to break down the barriers to public access to information of all kinds, because as we know, so much of the information in the world is closed behind paywall barriers and so forth. And so I got into this sort of activist community and started to move away from the arts. And I got a full-time unpaid internship at the United Nations, and really studied sort of like the information access channels and ways of distributing information through intergovernmental sorts of bodies. And then at that time, I reconnected with my old friend, Lauren Cardelli, who's the president and founder of A Growing Culture. And he and I actually grew up together in Vermont, so it was, we've been longtime friends. And since I was in sort of the open access, internet hacking sort of library side of activism, Lauren got really interested in that, because one of the things that he was working on was how to sort of make the industrial agricultural complex obsolete, in that he's really focused on supporting smallholder farmers and their role in the food system and their role in addressing so many of the sort of interconnected challenges that we face globally. And he wanted to, this was in 2015, he wanted to create some sort of platform or some sort of database where we could store and make freely accessible all of these grassroots agroecological innovations that were coming from farming communities all over the world, but especially in the global south, where A Growing Culture was more focused. Although now they're doing a lot of work in the US. But, and so Lauren and I partnered up together to work on what became the Library for Food Sovereignty.
It's so
Um,
important right now in this current situation. We all need to look at that library.
yeah, yeah, and it was, and of course, we started off with this idea that it would be a platform, and it would be high tech and accessible to everyone. And quickly, we got into this process and realized like that if our main users were farmers in the global south, like they were not going to use this platform. So we realized right away that it had to be much more than a platform. Like this was about tapping into a community, and that this library was going to be offline and online. It was going to be sort of transcending many different spaces and communities. And that, very importantly, it wasn't sort of this closed database or like archival repository of documents or something like that. It was this living and breathing sort of, this river of all sorts of different agroecological innovations from communities all over the world.
I think that there's a huge lesson and kind of almost message in that story that I sit with a lot at the moment when I watch all these wonderful attempts in the kind of regeneration of landscape space, where people are building all these mechanisms for monitoring the impact of like the regenerative impact on a piece of land, and to help farmers maybe earn twice, not just for their produce, but for the positive impact on healing the landscape and the carbon drawdown and the regeneration effect. And all of it is wonderful. And I'm glad all this work is being done. But lately I keep asking myself, if we keep doing that, all these the kind of resource economy people who are of the sort of more Jack Fresno and Vino's project ilk, I'm concerned about, in the best of intentions, by putting everything on a platform that is ultimately digital, and you have to have a mobile phone, or you have to be in that game of being virtually connected in order to even engage with this well-meaning system. How we cut out, or how we technologically colonialize people who might have actually the right to choose that they would like to be smallholder farmers in their community, living in the ways that their traditions have taught them, and not engage with those technologies. Where do you sit on that double-edged sword of technology?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm not, after trying to build this platform for several years, I, don't know how much I believe in platforms anymore. And yet, yeah, I mean, I think that the big realization is that you have to be, when you're working on a platform, you're not just working on a platform, you're working on something much larger. And if you can keep that sort of big picture in your mind, then the platform aspect becomes just one tool in a larger sort of toolkit to use. So it's not this like end all, like we're creating this is the solution, this is going to do it all. It's sort of like, let's explore and improve our skills at creating tools and toolkits that can support in a variety of different ways, but that importantly are keeping that big picture in mind. And this is like, it seems really simple, like keep the big picture in mind, but it's actually really rare that people do, because everyone gets focused on their one role. And the work oftentimes becomes about improving and sort of building that one role, instead of flipping it around and saying, how is this, I'm not against expertise, but like, how is my expertise serving something greater? How is my sort of piece of the puzzle uplifting the entire sort of transformational journey that we're on? And with a growing culture.
You lived that particularly in the last couple of years, seeing all these wonderful people that you're trying to bring together in Common Earth, all having this, on the one hand, completely understanding, like if you build an organization like Drawdown or the Biomimicry Institute or Ecosystems Restoration Camps or Common Land, you know that it's doing good work. You know that there are amazing people working in it that you care about because you've met their families and you want to keep them also in a job. And then it becomes understandable that it becomes difficult to collaborate in that larger, beyond the organization's actual work, because people have that sort of dual allegiance of, yes, wanting to do the work, but also not wanting to jeopardize the work they're already doing. I've noticed that a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not like I don't experience that either. You know, we all experience that. Um, it's like sort of like we want to do good work, but first we need to take care of ourselves, right? And I don't know how to get around that. You know, I have, and in a lot of ways it's depressing because it's like so much, there isn't social scaffolding or infrastructure that uplifts and sort of supports the transformation that is really needed. And we're all we have like good ideas in our head, and like the content of what we're promoting is incredible, and yet we're stuck inside of old business models and nonprofit structures, and we're really trying to make this leap to something that we don't even know what it is. And a lot of times I find these structures are holding us back. And I'm also not saying like that structures aren't useful. I think institutions and organizations are useful in some cases, but in other cases they can hold you back.
I just wanted to come back briefly because what we were talking about earlier with the platform, because it reminded me, like yesterday I had a conversation with Martin van Hildebrand from Gaia Amazonas, and he told the story of how they've been helping in Colombia to protect lots of, like over 1 million hectares, actually the wider territory is 16 million hectares of Amazonian rainforest, for the indigenous tribes that live in them and have over years fought for the land rights for these people, so they actually own the right to their territory. And in his work, or their work with their wisdom systems of forest management by living in the forest as part of the forest, and the whole framework, like he was describing, that they're they still have this richness of the spirits and the totems and the certain areas of the forest just being taboo for certain times of the year, and it's because of the spirits. But it also, when you look at it from a biological point of view, it's because there's some important reproduction process or growth process going on, so it's best not to go into that part of the forest. But it's told in different stories that aren't just the Western rational story. And what I found interesting about it was that, because we were talking about the double-edged sword of technology and these paradoxes and dilemmas we constantly have to navigate between, or have to embrace, he was saying that the elders were worried that a lot of this knowledge was being lost, because when they were putting on 3-day ceremonies, the youngsters after a day and a half were like, okay, how much longer is this going to go on, and can I do something else now? And so the way that they began to actually engage the youngsters and rebuild the pride and the connection with that long lineage and storyline was to start using some technologies. So they let them make little videos about the stories and find new ways of capturing that knowledge in that modern technology. And while on the one hand it makes me wince, on the other hand I can see, well, if that's how you make the bridge between and engage the next generation in the value of that knowledge, fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think like the objective should not be to sort of like you know, go back to some ancient way of living, but we have to learn to be sort of those ways, in the sense that like we need to reposition and orient our technologies towards something greater. We need to, yeah, I think, live in relationship with our ancestry and what's come before us, and at the same time use our technologies as tools to extend and sort of evolve those relationships in new ways. The problem is that technology often comes in and is not in tune with those elements, right? It comes in and it's technology for technology's sake, or it's it's part of that never-ending growth sort of system. And so it's not that technology is the problem, it's that it's not being used in service of something meaningful. So
I
yeah.
think that there are almost two layers to that. I completely agree with what you just said. I feel like even when you get to the layer of being very cautious and conscious of that, it's still possible that underneath there is yet one more layer where, like I'm trying to say, comes more from what Bucky Fuller's advice. If you want to change the way people think, don't tell them what to think, give them a tool, the use of which will change how they think. And I think that with some of the technologies we're using, even if we are using them with the best of intention for a greater good, the tool itself still has a power of reorientating how we like what we look at, how we look at it, what data we see valuable, how it is processed, how we engage with that situation. And that's almost the more insidious kind of colonialization of the mind through technology, where it really takes deep practice to discern how much we all are influenced by that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of, like sometimes there's this sense of like, you know, capitalism and the, extractive, never-ending growth sort of economic system is like some sort of conspiracy theory or something to fight, when really it's sort of like worse than that. It's like the logic of a system. It's like the greatest artificial intelligence that's ever been created, right? And we don't even really see it. It's like the air we breathe, right? And so I'm reminded of that sort of idea, in that we don't know, how that technology is in relation, in relationship with our minds, and how we're being influenced by it.
Lately, I've come to a couple of like very basic insights. Like they're almost so basic that you feel like, but duh.
The best ones, typically.
And with regard to the whole capitalism story, because we've had this conversation before. Also, again, this attempt of how do we internalize externalities and like social and environmental impact into this whole conversation in order to avoid these externalities, in order to give them a place in the mapping and in the understanding, so things get better. Yeah, it's a well-meaning attempt, but with all these people working on social capital and natural capital and all that, it's also in danger of becoming a mechanism that actually monetizes social relationships and monetizes the last areas of commons that like it could so easily, again, in constructing these systems that are supposed to funnel money towards regenerative practice and large landscape regeneration and 1,000 landscapes and all of that wonderful work. But the danger is that the minute we invent the conversion rate of these different capitals into economic capital, we're actually enclosing all of those human relationships and deep wisdom to land in that economy. And what the baseline of what you were just saying, that we don't really understand that it's the air we breathe, is that simple understanding that there's a difference between our culture and all native peoples everywhere in the world, is that we believe that land can belong to us, and they know that we belong to the land.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
actually really profound.
It's really profound, and to extend that a little bit further, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I've really come to also have this really simple yet profound understanding of the work that I do and the work that we do at Common Earth and Cloudburst, and that is that the real work is working on each other. We may think we are doing a regenerative roadmap for New Zealand or Costa Rica, but really we are working on each other, and we are learning. We are in developmental learning relationships with each other, and when all is said and done, that those are going to be the most transformative aspects, and it, in the sense that then the rest will come from that. And this is why I tend to, with colleagues and friends around the world, I tend to focus first on a sense of solidarity with that person, and then whatever comes will come from that place, rather than rushing into some work stream around some good idea without having established that sort of base of trust and solidarity with the person. Because it's when you rush into these sort of functional relationships around good ideas, and there are so many good ideas, right? Without that connection, and it tends to not be as long lasting and transformative.
It's a very different way of working. That first way needs MOUs and contracts and financial arrangements and all of that. The second way is a alignment of shared intention and building circles of trust that then, I mean, you can get burned with that too. We all know that, but more often than not, you don't get burned, and it creates an agile way of working that doesn't need all this fluff around that takes so much energy and so much resources, and actually changes the energy and the impulse in the world.
And again, I could add disclosure after disclosure, but it's not to say that MOUs aren't useful, or that strategic plans aren't useful. It's just to say that if you first focus on establishing a rich culture where people are there because there is a profound exchange of value, and that they're not there because they're getting funded to be there, or they're not there because of some vanity play. They're there because they're learning, and because they feel a sense of solidarity with what you're working on and what they're working on. And then from that, funding can, if you first establish that, then getting some funding will really go a long way. Or, signing that MOU will be much more impactful. At least that's what I've found. And this sort of brings us right into Common Earth and Common Earth Alliance, because, Rola and the Secretary General, Patricia Scotland, they've been convening regularly since 2016 at the Commonwealth, as you know. And at our last convening in October of 2019, Rola and I realized that that we could and we should be doing more than just convening. There was actually this opportunity to sort of harness or operationalize a larger movement of a variety of different organizations and initiatives and individuals that were working in this regenerative space. And so since then, we've been working on evolving this Common Earth Alliance concept. And we're sort of building it as we go, but it feels like it has a lot of momentum, even though there are no formal agreements. There is no funding in place. But what we've been able to do is establish that sense of solidarity, establish that sense of trust, and that people are coming because they're learning an enormous amount from each other, and they love the dialogues that are taking place. And I feel like to have that as a foundation, and again, it takes time. It's not just like you set it up in a week or you design it and then you implement it. It's an ongoing process that you have to prioritize the culture that you are cultivating. That's the priority, and that's the key.
It's interesting because I completely agree, and having been involved in varying degrees, much more in the first meeting in October 2016, and then less so in more of a kind of listening and feedback and a little bit of advisory roles since then. I've been more and more in opportunities to have these learning conversations around a wonderful project that is really worth doing with amazing people. But we very often want to create inclusive groups with a diversity of contributions. And very often you hear the voice, why aren't there more young people around this table? Or where's the global south representation, or where's the real grassroots representation? And that's the sort of shadow side of what you said. Nobody's around the table because there's funding, or they're only there to learn. There is a certain privilege of being either through trajectory in life stage, like where you're at in your life, in a situation of being able to dedicate X amount of time to that kind of learning or non-income generating collaboration. But what it often does is either really committed people that have spent all their life working for grassroots organizations and haven't built up any resources to coast on, to make time for those kind of things, or young people who are still not in the process of having established a way of earning an income that then frees them for these processes. They can be quite time consuming, and because they are deep learning journeys with a wonderful community, and they're so worth it. But what I'm getting at is that without intending to do so, there is a little bit of selection of a group that can do this, and there's some people on the fringe that should be in the conversation that are in that tension of between serving self and their family and serving the larger whole, that they're also part of not being able to engage in the same way. Have you noticed that with some of the people that you would have liked to have involved?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, not everyone can be involved in a process like this.
Mm.
And yet, I have over time gotten used to and have some peace with the reality that nothing we do will ever be perfect. And so
Another deep and profound wisdom.
yeah, and that actually this impulse to try to make it perfect, to try to craft the perfect jewel of equality and this sort of like intellectual, yeah, gem of a project or an initiative, um, to focus on that is to miss the point. And also to focus on that is in a way to at least I've found in my subjective experience of working on Common Earth, is to actually move into a place in the future or in a place in the past and not be present in the context that we are in, right? So we, in the regenerative movement, we always talk about place source potential and context, and how our efforts need to be site specific and rooted in community. And that's not to say that you don't at times break down those silos of your comfort zone in your community and search for new inspiration and new perspectives. But what I've found is that, trying to get out of thinking in the past or thinking in the future and really presencing what is available to us, because there's so many dimensions to a project or an organization, right, that aren't just about the idea, right? That's actually like, sometimes that's sort of like what everyone sort of congregates around, is the idea or the vision, the mission, the potential. And yet there are operations, there's funding, there's political dynamics, power structures inherent in every single effort that we do. And to sort of tense and shut those out and try to make it perfect is to, in a way, not tap into the true essence of what that thing wants to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, I resist the impulse to try to make Common Earth this catch all for everything, like as if we had to do it all in this one project. It had to be the perfect project, you know, ticking off all of the criteria of what a regenerative initiative would be, when it's not possible, because to work regeneratively is to reach for something that wants to be born, that is, you know, it's a process. And so it's, yeah, you can't just reach for it and have it be this perfect jewel and then now you do regenerative development, right? You have to be present. You have to tap into the unique potential of the community you're in. And so that's sort of what we've been focusing on, initially intuitively, and now with some sort of intention.
That speaks very strongly to another one of the profound, simple insights that I'm coming back to more and more, is how insidious, like for years, I mean, probably, I think the first time I wrote that sentence was in 2002 in my master's thesis at Schumacher College, that sustainability isn't an endpoint that we can ever arrive at, but it's a learning journey in community of how to participate appropriately in nested complexity. And yet, while I've rewritten that same statement in many ways and brought it into lots of my teaching and so on, I still find that sometimes I fall into the thought trap of spending time thinking about some sort of perfect end state and getting all the pieces of the puzzle in place, instead of really understanding that this is a developmental journey and it will never stop and we'll never get there. There is no end point that we can then down tools and say, wow, wonderful, we've made it. It's everything is hunky-dory, because the world keeps transforming. And once you really internalize that, then you can be easier on holding differences more lightly and still move forward with some shared intention, even if one person is kind of a bit techie new Green Deal and the other person is a little bit, no, you don't get it, it's all the wrong kind of green what you're talking about. But they're ultimately both people who want to serve positively, moving towards increased health and wholeness, and they can in the journey have the conversation, because where we arrive will be neither one nor the other future. It will be, we won't arrive, we'll just continue to keep learning on the way.
Yeah, and regenerative development is not the new religion, you know. That's not the point. The point is not to convince the smart ag or the, you know, more sort of green techie movement that regenerative development is what they should be working on, as if it was a different, just another topic, or just, you know, or the new religion. But yeah, and so I found that just a key part for me in this work is being able to hold coexisting different perspectives at once, and just increasingly sort of increase my own capability as an activist to hold coexisting and opposite and polarizing ideas all sort of at once, and give them a seat at the table almost in your thought process, in your planning processes. Because I think we would all agree that, like, none of us really believe in linearity anymore. And even the guy sitting across from the table that's, you know, working on climate smart agriculture or whatever, we don't actually know the effects that his work will have on our work. Extinction Rebellion and sort of movements that are more sort of protest focused on, you know, peaceful civil disobedience. You could on one hand say, well, they're taking a negative sort of problem focused approach, where, you know, in the regenerative community, as you know, we try to work from place source potential, right? We're sort of a very sort of positive, optimistic, hopeful at least, movement that's looking for sort of deep transformation, but not sort of picking out all the problems and working on problems. And yet we don't actually know the role that some of those civil disobedience, maybe they're actually raising the bar and the collective consciousness around this work that creates the conditions that allows our work to be successful. So if we get caught in this, oh, that's not the approach I would take, or what's that guy's problem, like he's doing, then we don't know, we don't know what effect that will ultimately have, which is why I really try to focus and embody and live by the, growing my own capability and capacity to hold coexisting and diverse perspectives in every moment, basically.
Yeah, no, I completely hear, and that is the essence of working regeneratively. Like like, for example, even just with sticking with XR briefly, they from last year to this year have already made a significant change in the languaging, from where the keywords were extinction rebellion and rebel for life, to more regenerate 2020, and much more also in
I love Extinction Rebellion, just so you
huh?
know. I
Huh?
love Extinction Rebellion. I wasn't trying to pick on them.
No, me neither. Like I'm so grateful that they've actually included regenerative cultures as one of their principles, or regenerative culture. And while they're still dancing with, is this just the culture that, how do we support ourselves in our activism and non-direct action, not non-violent direct action, and in raising the movement and taking care of the movement, or is it actually what I think that regenerative cultures is actually the answer of how we stop this extinction crisis and avoid runaway climate change and the breakdown that everybody now seems to be so focused on, that we're almost calling it in, if we don't leave the possibility of working a miracle, that back door open. I mean, I would love to share with you just briefly something that really, how that this holding, rather than falling into the paradigm shift, we need to go from this kind of thinking to that kind of thinking, and trying to force people along on the journey. The holding the polarity between different perspectives, the activating and the restraining force, and looking for the potential that lies in not saying it's an either or. These both perspectives inform, in like for the longest time, when again, wonderful well-meaning people that I know who are very much into the U process and Otto Scharmer's work, and all the who are working with all these U labs all around the world, they very often use the ego to eco framing, and it always rang a little bit too either or for me. Like the sort of the, in the seed of making that move, I always felt that's not a healthy relationship to relate to self. And let's not be devil, like, I mean, ego has become a bad word, and of course in a certain interpretation of the word we know why. But what we were talking about earlier as well, in a number of different nuances in this conversation, is this tension, this polarity that is common to all life, which is being for oneself and being as part of a larger whole. And I just want to share this image briefly with you, because hold on, where is it? Share screen, this one. I found this in a linear next to each other way, and I've just played around with it to put it into a tetrad, into triad. Like the ego dimension of how do I take care of my family, my community, my place, and do my work right here, right now, in this place, and how do I build the connection to serving the larger whole that this place is part of, whether it's my community in this bioregion or this bioregion within the biosphere. The way we resolve that tension is if on both ends we actually understand that serving life, uh, um, but as a keystone species. Like, because that another danger of this eco framing for me is either you deny the importance of self-care, and you will not be able to serve your community and the planet if you can't, if you don't serve yourself and your family, but also in getting lost in just serving the like the I've lost my my train of thought right now. Yeah, the subsuming into eco of, oh yeah, we're human beings, we're so wrong, we just have to be part of the web of life and be humble little critters in it, is not speaking to the potential of human beings. It's not speaking to the fact that we can actually, and that now that we have fucked up the system so badly on so many levels, we have the responsibility to become healers and keystone species and nurture health and resilience and abundance and increased bioproductivity. And again, it's an ancient wisdom, that like that
Yeah.
really. What do you think about this resolution?
Well, yeah, no, I think it's ancient wisdom. And when sometimes people, when we talk about ancient wisdoms and having, going back to, people think that it's like we're suggesting we go back to that, and really it's not about going back, it's being of that. I was reminded by what you said earlier, how you have these sort of these profound like realizations on something, and usually when you have a profound realization on something, it feels like you're remembering something that you already knew, and it's very, very simple, and in a lot of ways it feels like you're going back to, and that's what awareness is, right? Awareness happens instantaneously. It's an instantaneous realization of something that has always been there, but now you're fully understanding what it means. And I actually think that probably transformation is similar to that. Like I sort of have this idea, and maybe I got this from Krishnamurti, I'm not remembering. I'm horrible at attribution. I'm such a bad scholar. But this idea that, yeah, transformation is instantaneous. It will happen like that, which sort of for a rationalist, mind is hard to wrap your head around, right? There's so much to do, right? We're so far away from transformation. There's so much work to be done. It needs to be done so quickly. And yet we just really don't know what's going on. And that's increasingly clear. I mean, people's lives are changed overnight. You can have a conversation with someone, lately in these times of COVID, I've been feeling like people that I've never even met in person, I'm all of a sudden like deeply connected to in very little time. And so, yeah, I just, not to get all weird on you, but I feel like the time scales, there are so many different time scales on how this is playing out. And transformation, I think we're just beginning to comprehend what that could mean. Right now, we feel like transformation means change, and change requires a lot of work. But that idea of change being a lot of work is also coming from that sort of industrial mindset, right? That a big problem requires a big response, and it's going to be a huge undertaking.
I completely resonate with that, and it brings me to, there's two things that I would definitely still want to cover. One of them is, I want to learn more about the alliance that you've been building. I know who's involved, but it would be nice to hear you share it. But the other thing is, which we've talked about between ourselves before, and which I think you also, to like, I heard it, what you just said landed in me in that way, is that really this tension between, like, I use the word global a lot, working locally, like where you put your energy of being truly regeneratively in place, changing your being state, having more connection with your community, your land, taking the time for rituals of connection with people in place, and really practicing this, how do I contribute to the next greater whole in a daily way in your bioregion, And then the other thing is connecting all the good people that are coming into that way of being all over the place, or all over the planet, and enabling them to feel part of an emergent movement, that more and more people are coming home to place, that more and more people wanting to re-inhabit their bioregions and become healing presences in community and ecosystem. I personally find that I live an enormous tension in that. Where do I put my energy? Because when I listen to either of people that are very strongly focused on either of those scales, the very local or the global connecting, it's so deeply important work, both of it. And somehow I think we need both. But I get lost in terms of my own capabilities in terms of time and energy, and
yeah, but that just means that it just means you're paying attention. Of course you're lost. We're all lost, you know. It's really challenging to live and to live in these two, to fully be yourself and support, you know, regeneration at a family scale, on a local scale, on a bioregional scale, and then also be working on the global side. So to think that that would just somehow be easy is a total illusion, right? But I would just encourage us all to also, like, that we always have this idea, if only I could be in that place, then everything would work out. Or if only I could, you know, if only I had enough money to leave my office job and farm the land, then that would be like the real transformative, you know, decision. And I think that that's not quite it. I think that actually transformation is always available to us in any context, and that feeling of tension and confusion and being conflicted between those are all signs of a healthy person. Right? So feel encouraged that you're discouraged, because otherwise you would be numb. You know, if everything was going perfect, and, you know, it's almost like, you know, those of us who are, you know, you think of the CEO who's just got it all together and he's perfectly happy, great life, and actually those are the most dangerous, I think, you know, people in this society, because they're completely numb to the illness and disease in, you know, our society and our culture, and they've completely given over to, I think again it was Krishnamurti, you know, it is no sign of health to be well adjusted in a sick society, right? So and so yeah, honor your discomfort, and yeah, lean into that edge a little bit.
A beautiful, I mean, Paul Hawken just quoted it. It's by some woman author, I can't remember her name. This notion of blessed unrest that drives so many of us, I think, is, yeah. Again, it's another thing of framing what I was saying earlier, that there is no end destination. There is no perfect have my cake and eat it. There is no, if only I had all this in place, then I could live happily ever after. It's to just really embrace that these tensions are part of being alive, and they're part of what's making things interesting and creative. But it also means sometimes you have to listen to them and understand. What I'm coming to in my personal life right now is to also say there's a breathing in and out with these things. And like right now, I have a young daughter, and if for the next 2 or 3 years I swing more on the side of planting a food forest and creating a little watering hole in which I can welcome my local community to think about our bioregion, it's a time where I can be there for my daughter and do all the things that are also really important to really live and practice what I preach, and then to trust that it's not my responsibility to do anything, in the sense that if it's a global movement, people pick up the ball and run with it for the next 3 years. If I'm less online and more analog for a few years. There's a sort of narcissism in believing that I have to be in both areas because my contribution is so important. Like, it's also okay to just disappear for a while and take care of the caretakers. At least that's what I'm
Yeah, of
trying
course.
to tell myself at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I live in a house with 4 generations. I don't know if you know this. I have my 2 kids, my husband's parents, and my husband's grandparents in a 3-story house. And I see, my mother-in-law has completely given herself to caring for my children when I'm at work all day. And she also has her mother who's elderly and is also caring for her. And you just, when you're like close up in that reality, that like that is seriously transformative work. Like it's, so it's yeah, we don't know where the most change is happening, and to try to measure it constantly, I think, is missing the point. um, and I think, yeah, as the regeneration movement is increasingly moving towards, alternative metrics and ways of evaluating how we are being impactful. And I'm so encouraged to see so many of my colleagues that are, really thinking about regeneration at a family scale, at a local scale, in, how well they know their neighbors, for example. I mean, these are critical dimensions of what we mean by regeneration. And if we are point focused on our professional contributions to the regenerative development movement, I think increasingly we will find that impulse is part of what we are trying to move away from. And yet it's still so hard, and I struggle with it constantly. So I'm not suggesting that I'm enlightened or anything.
But it helps so much to just voice these things, and also find peers struggling with the same dilemmas and embracing the same paradoxes. Because then, I mean, that's the power of circle work and sitting in a council circle, that you hear other people voice something that you were starting to, or I was starting to think, like, am I crazy? What's going on? I need to, and then when you hear somebody else, okay, they're struggling with the same human dynamic, it gives yourself sort of permission to say, okay, maybe I'm not crazy.
No, I mean, this is what Regenesis calls second line work, in the sense that we have to hold each other in this field in order for the field to grow and to evolve and to enter into our collective consciousness. And that's why I always say this is awareness building work. It's solidarity. It's work in solidarity. We have to sort of build the social scaffolding and infrastructure that allows us to do this work. And in the end, we are working on each other. We may think we are, making a food forest, or, creating a regenerative development map. And yes, that is one aspect, but there is so much more going on. And the more that we can sort of creatively lean into that mystery of the unknown, sort of mysterious thing that's happening, that we're all part of, I think the closer, I think the evolutionary leap that we're wanting to happen will get closer to us.
Yeah, like Ram Dass said, we're all just walking each other home.
Yeah.
But who are the people that since 2016 building these meetings at the Commonwealth that started with this impulse, regenerative development to reverse climate change, and have gone into all these transformations, and then Common Earth was created and launched last October. And now you're moving in, like, you've mapped and you've had conversations with people in the grassroots end of the spectrum, and also political players who are willing to take their member nations of the Commonwealth into road mapping processes, whether it's New Zealand or a non-Commonwealth member, Costa Rica, with the leadership of Edward Miller joining this idea, can we pioneer one of those road mapping processes? in this mapping, in these conversations with some of the pioneering people in the world doing regenerative work, who have you identified that you will build this alliance with, and what are the projects that currently give you most hope that there's this something transformative is emerging?
Yeah, I mean, the primary people that are involved, I mean, Rola obviously is the mother and the constant caretaker of everything that we do. Ben Haggard recently gave this analogy of Rola, which I thought was brilliant, was that in some of the Lama Buddhist communities that he's part of, when an important conference or meeting or meditation session is taking place, there will be one sort of elder monk that will sit in another room, and while the ceremony is taking place or the session is taking place, they will be in a deep state of meditation, holding the sorry, I'm not a Buddhist, I'm not very articulate about this, but they will be sort of holding keeping the candle alive, keeping the fire alive for the entire group. And Rola's sort of like that. She's like, that's what she's doing. I mean, she's doing so much more, but like in her essence, that's what she's doing. And
very briefly, do you know that what he described is actually happening at the United Nations? Like a lot of people don't know that, but there's something called the Spiritual Caucus of the United Nations, and there's a meditation room at the bottom of the building where the big hall that you always see the Security Council meeting in and all that. When the Security Council is in session about a global crisis, there's always people underneath holding the space in that way, like actually meditating and holding.
It's incredible. No, I didn't know that. Yeah. So yeah, but so beyond that, the way that we've been evolving Common Earth Alliances, we started with pulling together a core team. So myself, Rola, Stuart Cowan, Ben Haggard, Pamela Mang, May East, and several others have come in and out. It's sort of an informal gathering. And the core team chartered the Common Earth Alliance. So we worked on what is the purpose and the role, what is the ultimate end state vision that we're moving towards, and so the core team chartered that, and we've adopted this sort of structure that Pamela Mang and the Regenesis folks introduced to us, called core team, task team, field team. And essentially, it's a very flexible structure that is designed to support emergence. So the core team is sort of keeping the big picture always sort of alive. And then field teams form, or what we call working groups in our case, around specific topics, mostly in sort of the infrastructure. I'm using infrastructure differently than we typically think of it, but like, big topics like education or finance or gender, national scale regenerative development planning processes. These working groups have formed, and a core team member is present in each one of the working groups. And then as these working groups sort of scope and define the trajectory of their work as a team, task teams bubble up to focus on specific topics or deliver a project. So the working groups, we've launched 3 key working groups: regenerative finance, regenerative road mapping, and a working group focused on projects. And each one of these working groups is chaired by an individual, so not Rola or me, basically. And so Stuart Cowan is the chair or the key facilitator of the regenerative finance working group. And we're 12, I think there's 12 people in the finance working group. Caroline Robinson in New Zealand and Edward Mueller in Costa Rica are sort of co-chairing and co-facilitating the Regenerative Road Mapping Working Group. And then David Hodgson is facilitating the project working group, and that's just getting off the ground now. So each one of these working groups, you can see how there's overlap between the working groups and the core team in an attempt to foster alignment and collaboration in service of the final end state sort of goal. And all of this is rooted in the context of the Commonwealth, so it's not some abstract thing. And the core team has begun a process of working on what we're calling a Common Earth Alliance project portfolio. And so the working groups and the core team and the wider alliance, because as task teams bubble up, the task teams also reach out beyond the working groups and involve. It's a very sort of fluid, alive, ongoing process. And everything is anchored in this portfolio of projects. And again, the portfolio of projects, it's very diverse geographically and also in terms of scale and stages of development. So you have projects such as Christopher Nesbitt's Maya Mountain Research Farm in Belize that's now scaling and looking at the Rio Grande watershed in southern Belize. So you have a watershed scale project. And then you have, bioregional scale initiatives, ecological mega-region scale initiatives. We're working on something with CARICOM, the Caribbean community. And then you have national scale projects, such as what's being brought forward in New Zealand, what Edward Mueller is working on in Costa Rica, and Jason Twill, to a large extent as well, in Australia, has seeded a national scale Regenerate Australia project.
And the New Zealand project, I thought that the New Zealand project initially was sort of Auckland Bay focused. Is that now moving to a national scale conversation?
It's moving to a national scale conversation, and I've had a few calls with James Goodhue in Wellington, who's close with Jason Twill and is working on an urban regeneration housing project in Wellington. So that's being pulled in. But essentially, the national scale, we're still trying to understand the role of the road mapping working group in relation to a national scale effort. So they're not the same. So Edward Mueller has his sort of in-country team that he's been evolving for years, as Caroline Robinson has her Auckland-based, but now much larger team. And so each one of these groups is involved with their own sort of process around thinking about how regenerative development plays out at various scales, ultimately at a national scale. But the Common Earth Alliance Regenerative Road Mapping Working Group, such a mouthful of these working, is still defining what its role is, but it's probably more of like a thought leader role and a role in, we've only had one meeting. We have our second meeting tonight, actually, but we're also looking at the role of story in national scale regeneration, because a lot of times framing a story around because the idea is not to replicate regenerative technologies all over New Zealand. It's much more about, I think, fostering solidarity and hooking it in with national planning processes at a government level. So there's a lot of territories to be explored still. But the Common Earth Alliance Road Mapping Working Group is a group of individuals that are thinking about regenerative development at national scales or have been engaged in some capacity in that inquiry.
I just thought of something that sort of ties to a loop to the beginning of our conversation with a growing culture and the importance of food sovereignty and empowering communities in place. How, like, the one piece that, since it is an initiative that through the Commonwealth Secretariat is actually linked into the policy making process, or an advisory role, albeit a convening role. Of those 53 Commonwealth countries plus one Costa Rica, the role of enabling the political architecture through really making subsidiarity the core organizing principle that allows to reorganize human patterns in a way that they actually sync with what we've learned from ecosystems and how ecosystems work and how health is maintained in nested wholeness that we participate in. That's another one of those learnings that I'm sort of distilling in my own life at the moment, is that actually the work on subsidiarity is hugely important. Like we will not get this process of capacity building in place to help people in place to meaningfully express the gifts they can give to their community in service of that greater whole, which is their bioregion and the planet, if we don't also enable them to really participate in the political process in a different way and make decisions at scales that really matter to them. And so it's almost like we need to flip the entire political process from regional and national and international scale, taking on really important coordinating roles, but not the rank and the power that they have, where the rank sort of needs to be flipped into that it's the local communities that need to be more empowered. Is that conversation at all on the map in that process, or not yet?
Very alive. It's very alive, and it's we don't have any clear answers. But what I will say is that we tend to think of capacity development as like this thing that needs to happen locally, whereas capacity development actually needs to happen up and down, nested scales. You can't just build capacity locally and then have a government not understand the value of it. You have to do it at all scales. So Common Earth Alliance, what it's really doing, and you keep hearing me say the real work is working on each other, and that's what I mean by capability and capacity development. We need to work with each other in a variety of different ways, up and down nested scales, to change the way that we live and work and approach problems, or potential in the case of regenerative development. And so capacity development, that's the goal of Common Earth, not the goal, well, in a lot of ways it is a goal, is to be able to collectively, in a highly coordinated way, work on capability and capacity development up and down these nested scales, from a grassroots level up to a national scale sort of effort. And it happens, it's manifested and expressed in all of these different ways, right? It's not always expressed in like an initiative on capacity building. Like we organize ourselves around first principles and values as an alliance. That's why we charter the alliance. That's why we charter the working groups, is so that the organizing framework for the culture that we develop within each one of these teams is based on those first principles of building capacity up and down nested scales. And that, that's very rooted in learning and being open to new ideas. And we actually have started saying explicitly that these groups we want to cultivate creative contributions rather than expert contributions, right? This is a fundamentally creative process rather than an opportunity to share expertise. Not that expertise is, not valid. It absolutely has a place, but when we're thinking creatively as a team, that's when new thinking comes forward, rather than getting stuck in a lot of sort of the old thinking patterns. So anyway, you appreciate the complexity of this work, and nothing is perfect. We're currently working. In 2018, we were involved in the inception and initial design of the Commonwealth Blue Charter that was adopted by the then 52 member states of the Commonwealth. to work collaboratively together to protect the oceans. And this year, we're working with the Commonwealth Secretariat on the Living Lands Charter, which is essentially the land version of the Commonwealth Blue Charter. And they are taking on some of the main sort of topics that we care about, such as regenerative sustainable agriculture, indigenous knowledge, biodiversity, water retention sort of technologies, agroforestry, reforestation, those sorts of things. And so there's this opportunity to link the Common Earth Alliance project portfolio of demonstration sites where you can see these technologies playing out in all sorts of different ways at different scales to a policy initiative that is being brought forward and sort of, socialized, if you will, with the 54 member states of the Commonwealth. So
now 54. Who
yeah, the Maldives just joined.
Okay, great. Didn't know that. Well, we could go on for a long time, but we probably should wrap it up so even the most patient viewers of 90 minutes of conversation get to an end with it sometime. The one question I feel tempted to ask, although it is a little bit in that sort of the future ideal state kind of line, is if you had a magic wand right now to make 3 wishes for the future of this impulse that is Common Earth, what's most needed to make this community of practice unfold its potential? Direct asks in terms of how people engage, funding, whatever comes to mind. What are the bits that you, if you say things work wonderfully in the next 5 to 10 years, where would you see this process going to?
Yeah, well, I think, I think you'll appreciate this, but I really value the culture that we create, working together. So I put most of my effort into, fostering a regenerative culture with everyone we work with, from a trustee level to Commonwealth diplomatic sort of levels to the grassroots community. So for me, regenerative culture and establishing that sense of solidarity is at the forefront of the way that I approach my work. And I think that when that happens, funding comes. It's not so I would like to see more financing being, brought to these communities, but with a different mindset. It's because it's not just about getting money to these projects, right? We have to change finance, and finance change is what I've heard the Club of Rome talk about. And so, those two are interlinked quite closely. And I think part of changing finance is it's connected with changing culture and working on regenerative cultures. A magic wand, and I also, magic wand would also be looking at what is the overarching political narrative that these countries take with regard to climate change and the other sort of interconnected global goals. Are we breaking down silos of thinking? Are we really sort of moving towards transformation rather than just trying to fix a broken system? And I'm still feeling a lot of like fix the broken system, as I'm sure you are. And so I hope that we can push countries to embrace different narratives and stories about what it means to address climate change.
It will happen. It is happening. I think it's amazing how catalytic this work actually is, and we'll never see the end of it. We'll never see the extent of the impact, because it travels like mycelium and pops up in surprising places. So Yeah, thank you so much for this conversation. I think there's a lot of really beautiful points that we highlighted just through the story of what we engage with.
Yeah,
So
thank you, Daniel. I hope it's useful.
and here.